In today's story, I want to tell you about the morning a completely ordinary parking decision turned into flashing police lights outside my apartment and 911 call made over something so minor that if I hadn't been standing there watching it unfold, I probably would not have believed it myself, because apparently parking close to someone's trash can is, in some people's minds, an emergency worthy of law enforcement intervention. It was a humid Saturday in late August, the kind of morning where the sun feels aggressive before noon and the air sticks to your skin the moment you step outside, and I had just returned from a long grocery run that included far more items than I originally planned to buy, partly because I hadn't been shopping in a while and partly because the store was running discounts that felt too good to ignore. So my trunk was filled with heavy bags of bottled water, canned goods, and frozen food that I wanted to unload as quickly as possible before everything began to sweat and thaw in the heat. My apartment building sits on a narrow residential street where street parking is both limited and unofficially competitive, especially on weekends when everyone seems to be home at once. And as I turned onto my block, I scanned the curbs carefully, noticing that most of the usual spaces were already occupied except for one open stretch of curb just past a row of neatly placed trash bins that had been set out for collection later that afternoon. And although the space was not enormous, it was legally open and large enough to accommodate my car without blocking a driveway, a hydrant, or any marked restriction. I pulled in slowly, checking my mirrors, aligning my wheels carefully so that I was parallel to the curb and leaving what I believed to be a reasonable amount of distance between my rear bumper and the nearest trash can, which belonged to the house directly across from where I parked. And once I was satisfied that I was within the boundaries of the space and not obstructing traffic, I turned off the engine, grabbed the heavy grocery bags, and stepped out into the bright glare of the late morning sun. I had barely closed the car door when I heard a sharp voice cut across the street, with the kind of volume that is clearly meant to summon attention rather than initiate polite conversation. And when I looked up, I saw a woman standing near her front walkway, staring directly at my car and then at me, her arms planted firmly on her hips, as if she had just caught someone in the act of vandalizing her property rather than parking along a public curb. "Are you serious right now?" she called out, her tone dripping with disbelief. And for a moment I honestly wondered if she was speaking to someone else, because I could not immediately imagine what I had done to provoke such intensity. But when she began walking toward the street with determined steps, never breaking eye contact, it became clear that I was the target of her outrage. I set the grocery bags down gently on the sidewalk and tried to maintain a calm expression as she approached, already sensing that this was not going to be a simple exchange. And before I could even greet her, she gestured dramatically toward my rear bumper and said, "You parked way too close to my trash can," as though I had committed a violation of sacred ground rather than position my car within a public parking space. I glanced back at the distance between my vehicle and the bin, which, while not generous, was certainly not touching or crushing it, and replied evenly that I believed there was enough room for the garbage collectors to access it, but that I would be happy to adjust if she preferred, because moving a car a few feet is hardly an inconvenience compared to escalating a confrontation. Instead of accepting that simple solution, she shook her head in visible frustration and said that it was not just about convenience, but about basic respect, insisting that parking that close created a hazard and demonstrated a lack of consideration for her property. And although I tried to explain that the curb itself is public space and that I had not blocked her driveway or damaged her bin, she continued speaking over me, her voice growing louder with each sentence as though volume might transform her personal preference into enforceable law. I repeated, as calmly as possible, that I could move the car immediately, but she suddenly pulled out her phone with an urgency that made my stomach tighten, dialing with quick, decisive taps and turning slightly away from me as she began speaking into the receiver, describing in dramatic terms how someone had parked dangerously close to her trash can and how it was creating a safety issue. And it was only when I heard her mention that she felt threatened by the situation that I realized she was not calling a neighbor or the city's parking office, but dialing 911. Standing there on the sidewalk, surrounded by grocery bags slowly warming in the heat, I felt a mixture of disbelief and irritation wash over me, because the idea that emergency services were being summoned over a few feet of curb space seemed so disproportionate that it bordered on surreal. And yet within minutes, the distant sound of a patrol car turning onto our street confirmed that this was no idle threat. The police vehicle pulled up behind my car with its lights flashing but sirens silent, casting red and blue reflections across the row of trash bins and the windows of nearby houses. And as two officers stepped out, I could feel the subtle shift in the neighborhood atmosphere as curtains twitched and a couple of residents stepped onto their porches to observe the unfolding spectacle, no doubt curious about what dramatic event had warranted law enforcement on an otherwise ordinary Saturday morning. The woman immediately approached the officers, speaking animatedly and pointing toward my car as if it were evidence in a criminal investigation, explaining that I had parked dangerously close to her trash can and that she was concerned about safety and obstruction, and I watched as the officers listened patiently, their expressions neutral, but increasingly perplexed as they glanced between the bin and my vehicle. When one of them walked over to me, I greeted him respectfully and explained the situation from my perspective, clarifying that I had parked in a legal public space, that I had not touched or blocked the bin, and that I had offered to move the car the moment she expressed discomfort. As I handed over my license upon request, I could see in his eyes the dawning realization that this was less a criminal matter and more a neighborhood dispute fueled by personal boundaries rather than actual violations. He measured the space visually, pacing a few steps between the bumper and the trash can, and then turned to his partner with a slight shrug that seemed to communicate what we were all thinking, that there was no law being broken, no obstruction severe enough to justify emergency intervention, and certainly no threat requiring immediate police action. After a brief exchange between the officers, one of them addressed the woman calmly but firmly, explaining that while she might prefer more space between vehicles and her trash bin, parking on a public street within legal parameters does not constitute an emergency, and that 911 is intended for situations involving imminent danger or criminal activity rather than minor parking grievances. And although she attempted to argue that it was a safety issue, the officer gently pointed out that the garbage collectors had ample room to access the bin and that no citation was warranted. I stood quietly during this conversation, resisting the temptation to react emotionally, because I understood that escalation would only prolong the situation. And when the officer returned my license and told me I was not required to move the car, I nonetheless chose to reposition it slightly farther down the curb, not as an admission of guilt, but as a practical step to bring the incident to a close and prevent further unnecessary conflict. As I slid back into the driver's seat and moved the car a few feet forward, I noticed the woman watching with a mixture of indignation and reluctant satisfaction, as though she had achieved a moral victory despite the officer's clear explanation that no wrongdoing had occurred. And once the patrol car departed, leaving the street to return gradually to its normal rhythm, she retreated into her house without another word. I gathered my groceries once more and carried them upstairs, reflecting on how a situation that could have been resolved with a simple neighborly conversation had instead escalated into a public display involving emergency services. And I could not help but feel that the most troubling aspect was not the inconvenience itself, but the willingness to weaponize authority over something so trivial, transforming personal irritation into a formal accusation. By the time I finished unpacking, the absurdity of the event had settled into a quiet realization about the fragile balance of shared spaces, about how quickly ordinary actions can be reframed as offenses when filtered through entitlement, and about how important it is to remain composed when confronted with disproportionate reactions. Because sometimes the only control you truly have in such moments is over your own response.